Hello, good evening. I'm Tracy Hampson and welcome to the second of our webinars on conservation grazing. We're delighted to have three speakers with us tonight talking about a range of subjects to do with grazing and grazing species-rich grasslands in particular for conservation benefits. There's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end, so can I ask you to post any questions you've got into the chat window on YouTube. So hopefully you've all found your way into the YouTube channel. Stick your questions in there and there'll be time to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the talk. You can use that window to say hello to people and tell us where you're from if you like. We've had viewers from very far afield before, so it's always quite interesting to see where people come from. While we just wait for people to join us, just a couple of words about Moor Meadows in case you're not familiar and in case you're new to this channel. Moor Meadows is a Dartmoor based community group of around 800 landowners, farmers and gardeners who are restoring or creating flower rich grasslands on any scale really, from field size down to shed roofs. So we've even got tiny little ones in gardens, churchyards and all sorts of things. We also have an online communication platform for people all over Devon, the Meadow Makers Forum, where anyone interested in meadows can communicate with each other, share information about their projects, recommend interesting links and books, start discussions, etc. The links to the website and the forum will be in the chat box at the end of the talk. So you can look at those and save them later. So I will, without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. So our main speaker tonight is Dr. Pen Rashbass. She's a conservation grazier and grazing advisor based in Derbyshire, so a bit further afield than Devon. She's the Peak District Region Facilitator for the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, the PFLA, and also sits on two DEFRA scientific advisory committees, the Animal Welfare Committee and the Farm Animal Genetic Resources Committee. So, yes, I'd like to welcome Pen.
Thank you very much. I'll just get my slides up. Is that working? Because I can't see you anymore. I'm assuming it is. So I'll start. Thanks very much, Tracy, for the introduction. I should say that although I do sit on a couple of DEFRA scientific advisory panels, this talk is very much my own personal viewpoint. I've tried to make the talk so it really is an introduction to animal welfare when grazing livestock for conservation purposes. So even if you know nothing about livestock management and care, hopefully you'll get something out of it. But it also means that because of the length of time I've got to talk about, just 30 minutes, I can't really go into too much details. But as Tracy said, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like me to clarify, then please just put them in the comments, and if they get passed through to us, I'll try and answer them at the end of all the talks. And I should also say that although all my pictures, or most of my pictures, have got pictures of sheep and cattle in them, because that's what I mainly work with, the basic concepts I'm covering actually are applicable to other species, whether it's ponies, pigs, goats, or probably most other species as well that you might want to look after, even if when you would get down to the details, those would actually differ. So if you do want to contact me, as I've just got at the top there, my Twitter handle is at peakpawprint. That's probably the easiest way of finding me. I do use it a bit. I'm not on any other forms of social media. So last week, you heard about how our natural habitats are shaped by the grazing herbivores in particular, and how you can perform a grazing impact assessment to work out what effect the animal may have on the habitat, and how by varying the species, whether you're going to go with cattle or sheep or pigs or goats or ponies, and the breed of the animal, whether you want to go which native breed you use, the time of year that you graze, the way that you graze the land, the number of animals you put on, the length of time that you put it on, the length of the rest period before animals come back again, they can all affect the ecological outcome that you actually have. And if you like, what you're doing in that is saying, what can the animals do to help us manage our land, to make it conserved, to help us help nature? But I think what I want to try and do today in tonight's talk is actually look at it from the other side of the coin. And it says, well, if they're helping us, what can we do for them to make sure that they remain healthy and happy? So when many people talk about setting up a grazing regime, they'll have their site-specific objectives, because every site is different, and what you want to do on that, whether it's for a particular kind of butterfly or flowers or whatever, is going to depend on a number of things. It's past management, it's what is historically there, the soil type, the terrain, and you'll use those to set up a grazing regime that would be specific. And from that, you might then choose whether you want to, which kind of stock you want to choose. And last week, you heard about how different kinds of, whether you had a sheep or a cattle or ponies, they all have different ways of grazing and impacting on the land. And that will affect your outcomes. And then also considering the infrastructure, what you need for your stock. But somehow at the end, what you have is, let me see if I can get this mouse in the right frame. What you have over here is kind of animal welfare gets stuck to the side very often. And it's kind of almost not quite an afterthought, because it is coming in when you're considering your infrastructure. But maybe it's not necessarily the main point. But I would like to say that maybe what we should be doing is actually putting animal welfare right at the top. So just as you're sitting there with your site-specific objectives, what you also need to do is think about what the animal welfare considerations are going to be right from the start. And I think one way to think about why we need to consider them so early on is to look at a very extreme example when you stand back and say, what happens if we just put the animals in and let them get on with it? And some of you will know this story already. This is actually a few years old, and it is historical. It's changed. It's no longer the case. But you'll have heard of this Dutch rewilding at Oostvaardeplassen, which is a 22 square mile national park in the Netherlands. And if you think that Dartmoor National Park is about 368 square miles, so it's about 17 times the size of this area. Also 17 times smaller. And what they basically did was they put in the animals, left them in there, and hoped that the ecology and the habitat would settle out over time. But what happens is that you would get these peaks where the animals would multiply, they graze everything off, and then because there wasn't enough grazing for the animals to actually carry on surviving, they would then starve to death. And obviously that's something that we don't want. And as I say, this is a historic story that is no longer happening on this park this way. But it does make us think that we can't go to this extremes. And even in their cases in the UK, it's not this bad. But sometimes we're so keen on pushing, if you like, pushing the grazing to a point that's going to achieve our maximum grazing for nature, what our conservation aims are, that sometimes the animal welfare may take a slight step backwards, and we need to think back and think, well, no, actually, maybe we'll just take a bit longer, we'll do things slightly differently, and think more about the animal welfare. So when we think about what we need to consider for animal welfare and what do they need from the land, a useful way of starting to think about it is something called the 5 freedoms. So these were actually developed in the mid-60s, or started off from the mid-60s, from a report by Roger Bramble. What happened was the UK government asked for him to look into the welfare of animals in intensive livestock systems. So these very intensive farming systems that were there. And he started looking into these, and these were then over time resulted in the formation of as a result of this committee report, resulted in the formation of the Farm Animal Welfare Council. And in 1979, they set up these ideas called the 5 freedoms. And this, if you like, freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. And these are now very widely used, not just in the UK, but across the world. But I should also say that a lot of animal welfare experts consider that they don't go far enough, and because they are, if you like, 4 negatives and a positive, and they should be considered maybe just the very basic that you need, and now it's more of a life well lived and the rest. But that's harder, if you like, to quantify and set up. But if you work with these 5 freedoms and you sit there and you say, right, I want to make sure that my animals are not going to suffer from hunger and thirst. What do I need to do? What do I need to do to make sure that they don't have discomfort, pain and disease, to express normal behavior? And so you can go through that and look at your site, just as you would do a grazing impact assessment to decide what the animals might do in the land. You can go in and risk assess the site to look at it. So if we look at the basic requirements that an animal needs, well, they're going to need food. And that might be a problem if they'd have a lack of availability. Is it the good quantity, good quality? At this time of year, you might still have plenty of forage of grass on the land. But as you know, with winter going on, a lot of it is now going brown. The nutritional quality of it is dropping down. Certainly in the Peak District in the last few days, we've had snow. Not many years ago, we've had quite a few floods. The land very often might have mineral deficiencies in it, depending again on the way it's been previously managed, or because of the soil type and the underlying geology that may be missing. When we consider water, there might just not be enough there in droughts in the winter. It might be pollutants, it might have waterborne diseases. And again, there might be freezing or drought, or maybe the animal has trouble getting to it if it's a steep bank. And here I've just put in a picture here that though this cow has been given food by the side, this was actually looking over down at the road, and I just saw it standing. I thought it's a good picture to take. You can see it's been standing in, because it's been poaching the ground, it's trampled it all up, it's become very wet. So although the animal has got food, it's standing knee deep, almost knee deep, in mud and water. So on the one hand, it has its food, but on the other now it's suffering from discomfort, if you like, in order to get that food. Then the next thing you might want to look at is physical harm from the natural elements. And this is fire and flood, your poisonous plants. People are always very concerned about poisonous plants. Very often, if the animals are used to an area, they kind of have learned to ignore it. And it's only they take a small bite and they wait to see if it makes them feel ill, and then don't eat it anymore. And it's only in extreme cases, like when there's snow and they can't eat, that they might go for something like rhododendron and laurel, which then would poison them. For something like yew trees, which is also a well-known poisonous plant, poisonous tree, it's very normally when it's growing on the tree, the animal tends not to get poisoned because it takes a bite and leaves it alone, nibbles it and leaves it alone. But what happens is, if a branch breaks or someone's put cuttings on your ground with yew in it, then the bitter taste that the animals don't like and don't eat, or don't want to eat, goes, so that they now eat it. But the poisonous components are still present in it. And that's when very often the yew ends up poisoning the animals. This is a picture of one of my sheep. It's a Hebridean, and we're currently grazing an old quarry, and what it's managed to do is get itself tangled up in brambles. They do like brambles to eat, and it's got itself tied round the neck here, and it's ended up being trapped in. So I'm very aware that this is one of the risks on this site. So every time I go onto it, I always have a pair of secateurs with me, so that if an animal is trapped, and it's not very often, maybe 5 animals in 2 months, but I know it's a risk, I'll go in with my secateurs and I'll just cut them free, and then they'll go off again. So those are the sort of things from natural predators. But it's also need to think as well as harm from it in terms of the weather. We also need to think, well, what are we going to do to protect them from extremes of heat and cold? Very often, shade is very important. In an open land, that shade can be difficult to get. In summer, I tend to rotationally graze my sheep through my land so that they're in small paddocks and I move them round by round. But it means on some occasions they don't have access to trees. And what you can see here is I've just put up the cheap option of just a few hurdles and a tarpaulin over it, and you can see a lot of the sheep have just gone straight under there to get some shelter. Ewes with young lambs are very good at finding shelter spot, any sort of nook or cranny in the ground. Here is the ewe has managed to put her lamb very nicely in a little nook in between some trees. And on some cases, you can also, if you want to go to the expense of building expensive shelters, but very often for especially for our native breeds, this isn't necessary if you have the right kind of trees, bushes, hedges, old fences, and the general terrain to give them the shelter that they need. And then, of course, there's physical harm from man-made structures. And that can be everything from your vandals, and I put dogs in here as your man-made structures, but you know, poorly kept fences, or maybe a fallen electric supply, shooting. And we mustn't also forget roads, especially on common lands. Every year, animals which are not the common land very often don't have fenced roads, and animals unfortunately tend to get run over. I've just been having several email discussions recently about what's been happening on the Gower Peninsula Commons, where apparently there have been 79 deaths of animals, sheep, ponies and cattle in just 15 weeks. And that may be due to more day visitors, as they can't go abroad, coming through the land and not knowing about the animals on the common land. And we've just basically been discussing how we can try and provide advice that might decrease this. But it is a problem, and it's not just, as I say, in this particular commons. It's very common all over the country. Then we have diseases. Again, this is the third freedom from pain, injury, or disease. And here we want to prevent disease or have rapid diagnosis. In this rather picture here, this is actually a young calf, and what's happened is the blowfly, he developed an injury because he was under the trees, and it caused a scratch. There you can see a fly maybe down there, and it's laid its eggs, and these larvae will hatch, and the maggots unfortunately will then bury into the skin, into the body of the animal, and secrete toxins into the body, and the animal can actually die from this, especially with sheep. And so we're very cautious about this all year round. And when I'm going out on site, if at the time when we have these fly injuries, I'll always carry stuff with me for treating if I see anyone with fly strike. But we try and treat these as early as possible, or else give preventative treatments. And one of the preventions that can decrease is shearing your sheep when it's happening in sheep. And then another important aspect is biosecurity. And you need to think just not what else who has grazed this land previously, but also nose-to-nose contact. Now, I should say these are actually cattle actually belong to the same herd, although one's a Belted Galloway and one's a Highland. They are actually pals, and they can actually get to each other, but they were within a fence line, and I just thought it was too good an opportunity to take a picture of nose-to-nose contact, and why you need to be thinking about who a cow, not just what's happening on your own land, but what your neighbors have as well in terms of preventing diseases. And then, of course, as well as sort of the physical side of things, there is also the psychological stress, and we want them to be able to demonstrate natural patterns of behavior. We don't want them to be bullied by each other, though in normal herd dynamics there will be some wounds. We don't want to be stressed for extremes, heat and cold and wet. So again, we're looking for shelter. We want them to have somewhere that's going to be well drained so that they can lie down. And then, of course, there are man-made factors, which I've included dogs in there as well. But noise and shooting and aircraft can be a problem, especially if they're not used to it. If you ever sit and watch livestock in a field next to a train going past, if they've never seen the train before, the first couple of times the train rushes past, the animals will often run away to the other side of the field. But after 2 or 3 times, they get used to the noise. They realize that it's not a problem, and they settle down. And so one of the things that we'll come back to is the idea that previous experience is very important to controlling psychological stress and fear and distress. If they've managed to get used to something in a non-fearful manner, then they'll accept it much better. And one of the other ways that we need to do when we're bringing the animals on the site is warn people that their animals are there. And some signs I would say are better than others. I personally I can understand why farmers put this kind of sign up. I don't think it necessarily is good for public relations. Signs that tell people what they're doing throughout the year can be very helpful, but a lot of walkers might not stop and read it. So a quick small sign that is very clear, or something that has the changing in size, so it's very clear what the main message is, and then people who want to read more about what we're doing on the land can stop and read more. So by using effective imagery on our signs, hopefully we can get the message across to the public, and they can help us keep gates closed, keep dogs under control, take their litter home, not and basically think that the animals, it's their home too. But as well as looking at all the problems on a site, when we go round and risk assess it, we're also looking for the benefits of the site. And one of the benefits is often having trees present. And trees aren't just for shade and shelter. Many of them, cattle, sheep, goats, love trees. They often have much higher mineral value. Some of them, as you may know, like willow, has is where the bark from willow is where aspirin's derived from, so it has some pain-killing properties. Some of the tannins, the secondary compounds in the plants, have worming property, have ability to act as wormers, and trees also make excellent scratching posts. And we often see the animals, especially as spring comes and their winter coat is thinning out for summer, they'll scratch along them, and all these scratchings and impact that they do is actually helping nature and developing a vibrant ecosystem. And things that people consider weeds, I often don't. So this is dock leaves. My sheep absolutely adore them. They have very long tap roots, so they're bringing up minerals that the grasses aren't bringing up. And if you're interested in knowing more about what herbs and herbal remedies are available, then this book by Juliette de Barragy-Levi, excuse my pronunciation, The Complete Herbal Handbook for Farm and Stable, is very nice. It tells you about each of the plants and also gives you some recipes for treating animals. So when we got to last time week's talk, there was a discussion about the grazing abilities of stock, and Jerry Tallowin described how different species and different breeds have different impacts on the land depending on how they graze and how they interact with it. But I think in terms, certainly from the animal welfare and also from what you're going to get from the animals, is you actually need to consider more. And as an example, of what I mean, I really like this quote from 1937 from a book by Alan Fraser, and it says, "Strange sheep on a strange hill behave like any ill-disciplined mob. They stray, wander, and get in all sorts of trouble. Sheep bred on the ground behave like a well-organized factory. They stick to their own bits of the hill, seldom straying from their own heft. They know the good bits grazing for themselves and where streams are safely crossed." So they know the land, they know where it's safe, and they don't get themselves into trouble. Your stray sheep who don't know where they are, they get stressed because they don't know. It's like you ending up having lived in the city all your life and then suddenly ending up in woods or on the outskirts. You don't know what's going on. You don't know what to eat. You don't know where to find shelter. You don't know how to find your way around. And that would be very stressful. And it's stressful for animals who don't know what they're doing either. And so what can happen is that can lead to ill health when they're stressed, and they can become more unwell. So if you're bringing animals onto a site that have not been there before, you really need to have them that they've come from a similar habitat and environment, so that hopefully they won't struggle too much. And ideally, in an ideal situation, you would bring out, even if you're only grazing for a short while, you would bring some animals back who have been on the site before so that they could teach others what to do. And it's not just knowing the environment where it is, it's also knowing what to eat. And this book by Fred Provenza that came out a couple of years ago, he's a scientist based in the States. He's now retired. But he talks about how even when the animal is in the womb, it's picking up flavors from the mother of what foods to eat. They copy what their mother does and looks at what to eat, and they also learn how to put them in their mouths and what's good and what's not. So young lambs and young calves, if they're given that experience early on, they then know when they go to somewhere else, so I recognize that food and I'll eat it. If they don't recognize the food, then when they come onto new land, they won't graze the land the same way. What also happens when they're learning at these early stages is that the microbiome, the bacterial growth in the rumen and the gut that function to break down all this cellulose and lignin, all the grasses, also are appropriate and are in the animal for doing this. So this early exposure and this early knowledge is very important. The other important thing is temperament, and it's here you got this is a picture of a young tup, a young ram lamb who's decided he's going to square up to someone a bit bigger than himself, because that's what he's like. And here you can see my friend Ruth Dalton, and she's feeding her sheep, and you can see that there's some very tame sheep, and there are others who are standing back and are more timid. And just like we have different temperaments, so our animals have different temperaments. And depending on who you're with, if you're with your pals and in a stable community, then the herd can be settled. You'll have the dominant ones and the less dominant ones. But if you change the herd around, or for some come into season and they don't, then the herd dynamics can change. As the young animals come up, they'll try and compete and settle at different levels, and other external factors. And certainly at this time of year, food and hunger, well, certainly as we go into January and February, can be a reason why behavior can change. Stress and ill health will also affect how an animal behaves. And just like you, if you've got a chronic pain or are worried, you might snap more easily. And that's the reasons why your animals may just change in their behavior. And what you can do is do something a number of conservation graziers do, is they do what's called docility scoring. And basically you're looking for animals that are going to be easily managed on the ground, that aren't going to be flighty and run out of control, and aren't going to be aggressive, but are going to be quiet and have a mild disposition, so that they're safe among the public, and they're safe if you're trying to work with them. And when we're working with stock, what we want to be doing is working in what's called low stress handling methods. And some of you may have heard of Temple Grandin, who's an autistic woman who spent years looking and understanding how cattle work together. She's done some books, and this is a Grazing Animal Project leaflet available on the Rare Breed Survival Trust website that also talks about low stress handling methods. While this one costs a bit of money, these leaflets are free to download thanks to the Rare Breed Survival Trust. And then in handling them, what you also want to be doing is teaching them. So as I said, just those early experiences, it's very important that they are as stress-free and as pleasant as possible. If you make them pleasant and nice, here with a bit of food while he's being in a yoke, a way of holding the cattle so that we can, in this case, probably in future do a TB test, but to examine him and check out he's okay, then he sees this as okay because he's associating it with food. So if we then did something a bit nasty to him, like put the inoculation for a TB in here, or maybe if he's got a bad eye, look at his eye, he won't be as bothered as if it's the first time we're putting it in, where he then always thinks of it as a fearful reaction. And very often what you'll find is that if they're in a pen, they'll sometimes that environment, especially if they're used to being outside, that penned environment is more stressful. And here is a young ram lamb who is feeling the pressure of being in a small area, and he's taking it out on his pals and asking them to give him space, forcing them to give him space and move away from him. And that's purely because he's feeling stressed, being asked put in a pen so that we can do his work. But while he's in this frame of mind, it also means that he's more risky for us to work with because he's frightened and that fear response. And so when we're working with him, these sort of animals that are a bit like this, we just need to be cautious as well. But what we want to be really doing is this sort of low stress handling. You can see that John here, who is used to be the grazing officer at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, he's now moved on. You can see he's nice and relaxed. His shoulders are nice and relaxed. He's keeping it calm. The cow and the calf are calm as he's moving around. And what we do is when we're moving them, very often, this is Paul, another of the new current grazing officer at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. We bucket train the animals so that they follow easily. And even with SOAs, here's one breaking away. This is my old dog. She's now retired, but she's very used to controlling them in a non-aggressive way and holding them. So even these flighty animals learn what's safe. And what we do is you need to also considering your handling systems. They don't have to be this high-tech handling system if your animal is calm. If your people are less experienced and the animals are wilder, then you need better handling facilities. If you have calm animals, and I think this is from Bill Grayson up in Morecambe Bay, a Lancashire sort of way. His cows is a conservation grazier of many years. His cows are very calm, and he can just use a few gates in order to manage them. And then just to quickly discuss how you might then go in and check your stock once you've got them there. You need to look and think about what you need to do. So just as I said, at the moment, when I'm going on the land, I'm thinking about that I need to take secateurs with me because I'm preparing that. I'll have a mobile phone with me, hoping that there's a signal on this site, which there isn't in all the way around. In the summer, I'll be taking stuff with me in case I find a fly with fly strike. And I'll check from a distance and see that all the animals are behaving as I'd like. And then you can check and look when they're close to. And if your animals are calm, they'll let you come up and check them calmly. As I walk in, I look at the dung and see what that's looking like. And also I'll check around the site and check that there's still enough food for them, check that the fences haven't been broken, that there hasn't been any fly tipping. And I'll also looking and seeing how their behavior is. So here you can see this young calf is quite inquisitive and its mother has got its head up and it's being a bit concerned and looking worried about what's going on with someone over here. While these cows here don't mind that I'm standing taking a picture of them, while this one at the back has got its head up, it's a bit more concerned, and it's thinking of running because it doesn't know me as well. It was a new introduction to the herd and doesn't know me so well. I'll jump that. So the key points, I think, are know your site, know your animals, and if you understand your animals and know what they'll tell you if there's a problem. And if you learn to listen to what they're telling you, then it becomes so much easier. It also is very important to develop all your skills as a stock person. One of the joys is standing and watching your animals and understanding why they do what they do, and learning low stress handling methods of not rushing and keeping things quiet will keep things happen. And then for your own safety, and we all fall into it because we think we know our pals, it's never be complacent around stock. And finally, my final slide, if you do want to find out more, as I say, there are these books that can be really, I think, informative. Then there's the Grazing Animal Project resources, which are now available on the Rare Breed Survival Trust pages under the Conservation Grazing site. And as I say, my Twitter is up here, and I'm always happy to answer questions through that if I can. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pen. That's really interesting. Yeah, so a few questions coming in there. I did actually put a link to the Rare Breeds website so people can pick up on that, because it's worth having a good explore on there, because as you say, there's a lot of useful resources.
Yes.
So I'm going to save questions to the end and move on to Phil's talk. So our next speaker is Phil Wilson. And Phil has been working as an ecologist since the early 1980s, initially with the Devon Wildlife Trust, so he's a bit nearer to home. That's for us down here in Devon. He completed his PhD on the ecology and conservation of the UK's arable flora, which he worked with the Game Conservancy, now the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and Southampton University in 1990. He then went on to work with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust on field-scale trials of field margin management, and then as a freelance ecologist and vegetation scientist from the early 90s onwards. He's had a long association with plant life, and he's recently been working on agri-environment scheme monitoring with Natural England, among other things, and he co-owns and manages a small farm in East Devon with pedigree Devon cattle, Shetland sheep, and a miscellany of other animals. So welcome, Phil, and thank you very much for coming along tonight.
Right. Now the first thing to do is to try and work out how to work everything.
You can just pop your power. That's it.
How's that doing?
Yeah, just go on to SlideShare, and then I think we're good.
From the beginning. Okay. Now I hope you can hear me. I was getting a bit of sort of strange wobbling effect when I was listening to Pen, so I hope it's all okay for you. First thing I'd like to do is just to acknowledge all the people. I'm going to be describing a large amount of work over the next quarter of an hour or so, trying to cram it all in. And because it's such a large amount of work, lots of other people were involved as well. Most of it done, in fact, all of it done under the auspices of Natural England contracts. So a lot of Natural England staff to thank for actually commissioning the work to be done in the first place. And lots of people who helped with it. Some of them led some of the contracts, I led some of the others. And of course, thanks to all the landowners who, and without them, would have been nowhere at all. Would have been stuck looking through the gate and not being able to do anything whatsoever. So as we all know, the villains of climate change, cattle standing there belching away. And as we all know, to stop climate change, we have to all go vegan and plant trees and stop grazing everything. I don't think that's the story at all. I'd like to think that that's actually the steps like that would actually be very, very destructive and very detrimental to our efforts to help stop climate change. I'm going to try and explain some of the thinking behind that from the data that we've gathered over the last 12 years now. So the work I'm going to be talking about, it's only coincidentally, initially at least, looking at carbon storage in grasslands. Originally, the work was looking at specifically trying to work out if there were any soil factors involved in the poor condition of SSSI grasslands in England. So in 2012, we managed to land a contract simply collecting soil samples from SSSIs scattered around the country to see if any factors could be pulled out of that to try and explain why some of them are not in good condition, refusing to respond to management. Got some preliminary results from that. It was carried on again in 2014. Managed to get even more results from that, and things were starting to look really interesting. So last year, I suggested to Natural England that it would actually be a really good idea to try and put together as much information on soils as possible from other surveys as well, and do a meta-analysis to see if we could firm up some of the results from our original work. And as you can see there, we looked at quite a lot of samples, and it took quite a lot of time over the years, starting in 2011 and ending up last year looking at upland hay meadows. So soil samples from 1,435 sites in all, from Cornwall up to Northumberland. Gathered from a range of priority habitat types. So we weren't just looking at one particular habitat. The results that we gathered were applicable to the whole range of grasslands of conservation interest in the country. Chalk grassland, such as Salisbury Plain. Acidic grassland, this one in Breckland. Lowland meadows. This is actually one of our own fields, about 50 metres away from where I'm sitting at the moment. In the summer, though, at the moment it's pouring down with rain and looking much grimmer than that. Purple moorgrass and rush pasture, the more acidic end of the West Country. And upland hay meadows. So last year we spent quite a lot of time, managed to dodge COVID lockdowns in the end, and got out to the Pennines and the Lake District and spent a lovely few weeks wandering around these beautiful meadows. Now, of course, we weren't just looking at the nice bits. The idea was to see if we could get any pattern out of comparing results from soil analysis from the nice bits and the less nice bits. So we were assessing condition. So essentially, whether the grasslands that we were looking at were being managed well, whether they're being managed less well, to see if we could see any difference between grasslands in favourable condition and grasslands in unfavourable condition. So, grasslands that were undergrazed and becoming very Molinia dominated, encroaching scrub around the edges, or grasslands like this one where bracken had simply spread over the whole area and pretty much destroyed the interest. So we were looking at different types of grassland. We were looking at grasslands in different conditions. We were also so we have a range of grasslands, different types, and you can see we had lots of upland hay meadows, lots of lowland meadows, and calcareous grasslands, acidic grasslands, and so on. Just as a sort of proof of concept, I suppose, just to show you, we didn't just look at carbon, we didn't just look at phosphate either. We looked at a whole range of soil nutrients. So we were looking at potassium and magnesium, nitrogen, total phosphate, soil texture, just as an illustration of what we were finding from looking at some of the other soil variables. Available phosphate, we could see that there was a massive difference in the amount of available phosphate in soils from grasslands in favourable condition and grasslands in unfavourable condition. We reckon that is a major driver of grassland condition. So if you have a high phosphate level, then you're much less likely to have a nice grassland, a nice species-rich grassland, than if you have a low phosphate level. And that was very significant statistically. Let's look at the bottom here. Not much difference between the organic carbon content. And given the fact that I'm actually supposed to be talking about the role of these grasslands in storing organic carbon, this is not terribly encouraging. But let's delve a little bit further. We looked at management as well. Now, all the soil samples were collected using the same method. We used slightly different methods in different surveys because of the different requirements of all these surveys to assess condition and to gather management information from landowners. So we had to reduce some of the complexity quite a lot. In the Upland Hay Meadows survey, for instance, we were carrying out quite extensive interviews with farmers and collecting all sorts of information about how they managed their fields. In other surveys, it was just a simple, are there cattle? Are there sheep? Is it mown? Or is it not managed? So, yeah, the sort of complex information had to be reduced to some very simple categories. And looking at management, we could actually see that there were some fairly major differences, statistically significant, between the amount of carbon stored in grasslands managed in different ways. So it's quite noticeable that if a grassland is being undermanaged or not managed at all, it's actually storing rather less carbon than a grassland that's being sustainably managed, particularly by cattle, but also by sheep grazing or mowing with aftermath grazing. So it seems from this, preliminary results really, and a lot more complexity perhaps, but management is an absolute key to the storage of carbon in grassland fields. So maybe the cattle aren't the problem after all. And looking at the different types of grassland, and looking at condition as well. So the graph, the figures I showed in that first slide with figures on suggested that there was no difference between grasslands, carbon storage under grasslands in different conditions. And actually, if you break it down by priority habitat types, you can see that in lowland meadows particularly, there's quite a major difference between carbon storage in grasslands that are in favourable condition and grasslands that are in unfavourable condition. And the same goes for upland hay meadows as well. The lack of significant results for the other habitats, I think, is probably down to complexity, really. And I think if we broke the results down a bit more, which we may well do in the future, we'd find some more interesting stories to talk about. But I think these are very, very, very promising results to start off with. And again, breaking down the management type by priority habitat, significant results for most of the priority habitats we looked at. So in lowland meadows particularly, there's a massive difference in the amount of carbon stored under a cattle grazed grassland than there is under an undermanaged grassland. And similar sorts of results for lowland dry acid grasslands and calcareous grasslands, not so much, but there's still a big significant difference. And in floodplain grasslands, much the same. Purple moor grass and rush pasture, not so much difference, but I think again, it's the detail is probably lost in the complexity of the habitat type. But still, I think that is a fairly convincing story to be told there, that essentially grazing is fundamental to carbon storage in semi-natural grasslands. So what do we think is going on here? Well, first thing to say is that these results do appear consistent with other experimental work that's gone on in other countries. That there were some very interesting experimental results from Germany and from America, which have shown a very strong linkage between species richness in grasslands and carbon storage. So it's quite a possibility that species richness is playing a role here. So are we looking at perhaps the effect of different rooting depths in grassland plants and the ability of the grassland to incorporate carbon into the soil? I think also one of the things we're looking at is that with grazing animals in particular, we're looking at the first stage of the breakdown of plant material and the first stage of returning carbon in the form of plant material back into the soil. Now, and then that's carried on by dung beetles, earthworms, soil organisms, and then the processes in the soil themselves become much more complicated because you're talking about microbial activity and converting larger bits of carbon-rich material into humic acids and eventually incorporating into the soil at depth as well. So we're actually seeing, I think, with grazing animals, the first stages in the return of atmospheric carbon into the soil carbon cycle, and then eventually, maybe with time, although we don't really know yet, into the geological. Now my feeling is actually, well, I haven't done the sums yet, is that the agricultural and the atmospheric carbon cycle is not strictly relevant to climate change at all. The important thing, that as long as there's no actual change in land use and no change in stock management
We seem to have lost Phil there, I think, unless it's my connection. Hopefully he'll come back online. Okay, we seem to have lost Phil. So we'll wait and see if he comes back. But while we are, we could actually pick out a couple of questions, I think, and see if he can pop back on in the next. Actually, I'm looking at the time; it's 20 past. So I think we might carry on with Simon actually, and then we can come back to Phil at the end, and hopefully he will have managed to regain his internet connection by then. So sorry about that. So our next speaker is Simon Berry. So this is going to be another slant on the whole conservation grazing theme. And Simon is a senior farm advisor with the Devon Wildlife Trust, and he's an organic farmer himself on the River Torridge at Beeford. And he's been with the Trust for nearly 20 years. As part of the Working Wetlands Projects team, he also offers a grazing link service, which I'm quite keen to find out more about. I'm not sure he's going to cover that. He has a lot of experience in grazing culm grassland and associated conservation grazing. So that's going to be quite relevant, I think, to some of the Dartmoor Meadow members that are watching. He has a pedigree longhorn herd which graze the culm every summer, and a countryside stewardship scheme. So without more ado, I shall say welcome, Simon, and hand over to you.
As they say, hello to everybody. Good, here we go. Yes, I farm on the Torridge. I would say I've been farming culm grassland for, most of my life. And my talk's going to be more about the practical approaches of managing culm, particularly the breeds of livestock, the importance of stocking rates, and some tips for management for people that are considering going into managing grasslands. So just to start with, if any of you get offered by a local farmer like myself saying, would you like to graze this little field for me? It's important you know that, like most grasslands, culm is very variable. And as you can see by what you can see in front of you, there's, you know, the tall herb fens, there's the culm grasslands there. They vary a great deal. So before you decide what stock you want to have and how you want to graze it, you want to make sure what sort of culm grassland it is.
Simon,
Because
can I just ask you, sorry, can I just ask you to pop your PowerPoint onto slide view? We've got some interesting views of ourselves in the background.
I've got it on slideshow.
You probably need to, you try the little icon down at the bottom. That's it. There we go. Lovely. That's fab. Thank
Sorry
you.
about that. So you heard that first bit, okay, good. Right. So yes, the different sorts of vegetation I was just talking about, rush pasture, fen meadow, tall herb fen, wet heath, all sorts of culm grassland that can be grazed, but some are a lot easier than others. So going on from what Pen was saying, it's very important that the livestock that you decide to graze can link well with the sort of pasture that you want them to graze. I'm going to be concentrating on the M23, M24, which is there's a lot of rush pasture and fen meadow, purple moor grass in West Devon. I graze about 200 acres in the summer, and my cattle come home to the 100 acres where I make all the forage in the winter and mob graze. So one of the things I want to promote more than anything is the importance of these chaps in front of you making a few quid. Because at the end of the day, if conservation grazing is going to be successful, the animals that graze need to wipe their feet. We don't do it just for fun. I'm a great believer in improving the quality of the diversity of the sward, but I also want my cattle to do well and I want them to make me a profit. So I think it's really important, and the top tip would always be when you're deciding what sort of animals to have, try and think of the site, the size of the site, how you're going to graze it, the stocking rate, then look at the different species, how much of the year you want to keep them out, how hardy they want to be. I think as a broad spectrum, you can say the traditional breeds are very much hardier than some of the commercial breeds. So they do suit grazing, culm grassland in particular. I've had longhorns for about 15 years, and before that I had a few white parks, and they didn't quite suit the culm grassland so well. They weren't quite so hardy. They had other traits, and I've got nothing against white parks, but I find that particularly around here, the longhorns or the ruby red Devons, you know, are the most popular for grazing these sorts of sites. Stocking rate is really important. So you mustn't overstock, and probably more importantly, don't graze too early. I say that because culm grassland grows on very heavy clay, can be very wet, and the ground can be quite cold early in the season. So as you'll see in some of the slides I'm coming up, if you start to graze too early, you can easily graze out some of the species that you're trying to protect. So you need to have a system in your farming where either you rotate or you can make sure that you don't graze the grasslands too quickly. Really important. I think the earliest I go out on the culm is about the third week in May, certainly never before then. Like any animal, cattle will always prefer younger grasses. This is a picture of this summer where for the first time in 12 years, I cut some of the culm for hay. And these cows went in first week in September. That site hadn't been grazed at all. And of course, there was a bit of regrowth then, and they went for the regrowth. And as you can see, the culm, which I'll show you a bit more and more, they left. So by the end of my agreement, by the end of September, the actual calm grassland probably hadn't been grazed quite enough because they were more interested in this. But I won't cut this site again for probably another 10 years if I can help it. It was just a good summer and I was a bit the sort of forage, and I was lucky enough to make some nice hay. So I just want to pop through the seasons and look at the sort of things, the link between the quality of the sward and the cattle. So this is a picture of lousewort on that particular site. So the first thing that comes onto my calm grassland is lousewort, early purple orchid, southern marsh, heath spotted orchid, that sort of thing. Now, I would never put cattle out onto this because they graze that right out. And there's not really enough forage there, as you can see. So immediately we're seeing that you don't want to go on the site too quickly. Allow these species to seed so you don't lose them. You wouldn't lose them if you graze them out, but obviously they've got a great benefit as a flowering plant early in the season. Now this would be the third week, just perhaps early June. And this is when I would say the calm grassland in particular is at its strongest appetite. As you can see, it's very green, but the meadow thistle is at its best. Obviously the meadow thistle, another very important food of certain butterflies, particularly the marsh fritillary, which we protect in this part of the world. So this would be the stage where I would be considering turning my cattle out. Now, I wouldn't graze the same site every year. I would like to think that this particular site, one year is left until August, so the plant has a chance to go through its full life cycle and seed. So I'll probably start in the agenda, the next field, and rotate, so this is started later the following year. So if this is a 60-acre site, I've got it in 4 blocks of, I was going to say 20, but 4 blocks of 15 acres, more or less, well fenced. So I will rotate every year which site I graze, so that it all gets a chance to do something different every year. But if you let the cattle in there, they would really go for that, because as you can see, it's very appetizing. And you would obviously you'd lose some plants, but at the end of the day, you've got to make sure that the cattle get the best and they're happy with their lot. Going to the other end, early October, this is devil's spit scabious, which is another very important plant of the culm. You can eat this out really early and you'll still get a flower in October. But if you put your cattle in here now, they'll trample it, but they won't graze it so much, especially if you've got the right stocking rate. So obviously scabious is a very important, beautiful flowering plant for late season. So again, it's important to have that stocking rate. I work on the whole farm, 150 cattle on about 300 acres. On the culm, I would say 1 unit per 3 acres. I think the set amount for most stewardship agreements are 1 livestock unit per hectare, but I like to think that can be quite tight in a very cold year, so I'd go slightly better than that. Now, one of the problems with grazing in West Devon is soft rush. It becomes very dominant if you don't manage it. And I've highlighted in front of you the soft rush area. I cut this top half this year, so you can see the line here where I cut. This was made for hay. And if you cut soft rush late in the season, when I say late August, and you've got good weather, it bleeds and it doesn't like it, and it doesn't come back so strong. If you cut soft rush when it's really wet, it'll come back just as strong. So you've got to sort of find the time. Being organic, I obviously can't use any other form of management. So on this particular site, if I get some really thick, dominant patches of rush, I try and manage it by cutting and picking up. I don't like to leave it left there, because obviously that fertility is going back into the soil. So that's how I think you should manage soft rush. Now, in West Devon, there's a lot of very small sites, like I'm showing you in front of you, and they are more difficult to graze, but really very, very important to the infrastructure of the wildlife. So it comes down to the things that Pen was talking about: good fencing, good water, and the right stocking rate. Plenty of shade here. This site would soon close up if it's not managed. You can see the willow encroaching. So just 2 or 3 cattle for the summer after they've been in my opinion, would be right. But the fences have got to be good, the water's got to be good, and it's not everybody's cup of tea. So any grazier is a really good grazier. Look after them. And I'll talk about the Grazing Link service a little bit more a bit later. But with all the things against farmers, particularly TB and the testing regime, if you can find a grazier that can work with you to graze your site, it's gold dust. I did mention tall herb fen. Well, this is a slightly different sort of calm grass, and for it, a lot less grass itself. But as you can see, there's a lot more angelica, meadowsweet, valerian, and the famous hemlock water dropwort, which everybody can particularly worry about. Now, cattle are very fond of hemlock, especially early in the season. If you turn cattle into the calm late May when it's young, they'll eat it off. And of course, understandably, some people say, well, you can't eat hemlock, it's poisonous. Well, it's the roots that are poisonous. So if you've got a watercourse running down the side of the site and there's a bit of mud where they might look for minerals and eat the roots, yes, then there is a danger. So again, it's management skill and training. You've got to know what the site is like, what you can do and what you can't do. But this sort of site will be a lot wetter, your stocking rate will be a lot lower, there's a lot more trampling effect than grazing. And you'd want to condition score your cattle so that when they go in here, they're obviously carrying a lot more flesh, because the quality of the forage wouldn't be so good. This is the same site, but one of my favorite plants, a sawwort. And this is a particularly dry area where the cattle will lie. This site hadn't been grazed for 2 years, but it hasn't scrubbed up too bad. But we hope to introduce grazing next year. And it also might be used for a donor site to move the calm somewhere else, because as you can see, there's a lovely variety of species. Yes, there is some practical physical machinery you've got to use on some sites. This was a site as the Wildlife Trust were asked to top for a farmer. I personally wouldn't have topped it myself. I didn't think there was any need, but he couldn't get any grazing in, so he just wanted me to run over it for him. I think it would have been better grazed and created more diversity, because there was no way of picking up the toppings here. But that was his choice. I just want to talk about introducing calm grass amongst trees, because there's a lot of talk about the benefits of payments with putting in corridors of trees at the moment through the Woodland Trust and Forestry Commission. And I'm sure the payments are going to mean that a lot of people will put in trees. But calm and trees can go quite well together. This was a site that we harrowed and put a seed bank down about 5 years ago, and it's come fantastically well. At the same time, a few years before, the owner put in trees. So here we have now a site which will soon be grazable, not just through the middle, but in under the trees. They're nearly getting mature enough so you allow certain animals in. So diversification, trees, calm, they can be all work together, but you've got to be very careful of the site you choose and how you go about it. Oxide heaven, yes. Now this was a case last year where we again did a dry meadow reintroduction for a farmer. Ate the site down tight at the end of August, or cut it for hay, and then we worked it and put some wildflower mixture down. And he wanted to introduce some oxide daisies, so he put some oxides in the seed mix. So as you can see, they've been rather dominant. A beautiful site, but possibly too dominant. But these sites will balance themselves out, and the next photo is the same field. And you can see that the yellow rattle is beginning to really take hold. So if this is managed properly in the next 2 to 3 years, the balance of this field will find itself, and a lovely wildflower meadow will be created. But the key is the grazier and the timings. It needs grazing at the right time, and it needs cutting at the right time for hay. And then the diversity of the site will improve. And of course, one of the other ways of managing culm, particularly the purple moorgrass side, is swaling in the winters. There's often a case where sites can't be grazed, so the Devon Wildlife Trust in particular uses swaling as a method on quite a few of its nature reserves, where the purple moorgrass dies off, gets too tusky, and you can burn it off. And don't think you can just chuck a fag in, because it will go. It's got to be really well managed and done with supervision, and quite a skillful process, but another good team job for volunteers who often help us do this. I just stuck this one in because being a farmer, every cost is really important. And I think if I had to say the most important management criteria for profitability, managing the culm, I would say less is more. The less overheads you've got, the more profit you'll make. And this is a case where this farmer was draining his field, and he put the water going to the water trough here, and then it runs out the back and goes out again. So there's no cost of water. It means they haven't got to pollute the streams. I think he got a grant for fencing off the stream. So everybody's happy, and as you can see, the water's really clear. So I always thought a very clever method of introducing drinking water into a site. A little bit about Grazing Links. I won't be long now, so we're getting there. A little bit about Grazing Links. It's a service that links up somebody with livestock with somebody that hasn't got livestock. So in this case, this particular farmer had a 5-acre meadow against the river, had no livestock. He rang me up. I found somebody with ponies in this case, because it really wasn't suitable for cattle. There was a bit too much soft rush. And the gentleman here brought the cattle over. And the key is to go through the methodology of a lot of what Pen was talking about, the importance of how to look after those stock, how to see them every day and what to look for. So we do a training to the people that are what we call lookers, who are looking after the stock. In some cases, they might be sites that are away from the farm and the farmer can't get to watch it. That might be a neighbour that's very happy to check the stock every day. So we put him through training, or her through training, so they know what to look for. And it works very well. But the responsibility is always with the farmer, and these sorts of things have got to be made very clear in the grazing agreement. I used to do a lot. I've got about 80 live agreements during the summer. There's a lot more ponies than cattle these days because of the problems with TB and the isolated sites, but it's still important they get grazed. And just a little bit of what else we do these days, introducing herbs into grassland, more the dry grasslands, really a possibility these days. This one, I think I'm just trying to remember what we were introducing. I think we were introducing plantain, red clover, chicory and birdfoot trefoil into a sward, which meant that it didn't have to be ploughed. And as you can see by this, it's just digging a furrow and dropping the seed in. Late autumn's the best time, so it gets the rain. This one took really well. Another one we didn't take so well. But it's new options that are available to farmers to create a bit more of a diverse sward. As you know, under countryside stewardship, there's a good payment for GS4, which allows herbs to be introduced into former arable land. And this is some of the work we're doing to help with that. Green hay is probably the most useful way of moving culm grassland in particular. So we bale the sward, and it's got to be moved within 7 hours. So cut, bale, and then move it to the donor site. Here you can see we've created soil by, I think that was spring harrows this particular farmer used. And then we go around and blow the grass before it heats up onto the site. So that's a very successful method of reintroducing culm back to what was culm. This had been improved over the years, and the gentleman wanted to put it back to culm again. And the other way is the seed collection we do. This, I was just trying to think where this site is. Yeah, it's just above Padstow, Trevose Head, that's it. And we were harvesting wild carrot in particular to mix in with some sites. A beautiful site, I'm sure some of you know it. But that's the seed we got, just harvested, so that'll be sifted and cleaned and then distributed out to other farms in our catchments as part of the project. So there's a lot of going on, not just the management of culm and wet meadows. We're doing some, obviously, introducing lots of different seed banks, and obviously more meadows are doing a lot of this as well. So just to finish, my top tips for you that are starting to consider grazing. Stocking rate is key. Make sure that you get advice of the right number of animals for the site. Breeds of cattle, how hard you want them, which are the best converters for that particular site, which cattle will make you a pound or two. Rotating sites, if you've got a specific really wildflower plant that needs protecting and you want to make sure it goes through its cycle, make sure you've got an option to move the cattle somewhere else so you can rotate your grazing. Concentrate on your costs. About 2 years ago, the biggest vet cost for me of my 150 cattle was the dogs at home. So I think if you get your stocking rate right and you've got happy cattle, immediately your veterinary bills come down. So this is really important from a farmer point of view. Stay on top of your costs. And that relationship with the grazier, make sure you give him all he wants to do the job that you want him to do for you. And that was a lot of things that Pen went through. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. That was really interesting and really good to see quite a mix of site types as well there. There's been a few questions come in. I think we're going to just try and head back to Phil just for the last couple of slides. Do you want to try and stick your PowerPoint up, Phil? And we can do that. You can just stick that on slideshow and we're away.
Can you see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Right. I'm not really sure where I got to. I was just explaining some of the theory behind carbon cycling and the difference between the atmospheric carbon cycle and the geological carbon cycle, and the problems really arise for climate change when you change from the geological cycle to the atmospheric one. If things remain at a steady state, so if you're not increasing the area of the area that you're ploughing, for instance, you're not draining peatlands or feeding your stock on arable produce such as maize, then there's actually no reason why livestock should contribute to climate change at all. And in fact, if you're maintaining species-rich grassland under sustainable stock grazing, it can function as a very effective carbon sink. So I'm saying, well, plant trees by all means, but make sure you're grazing the grasslands as well, and make sure you're not planting trees on the grasslands, because they are, a grazed grassland can be the climate's greatest friend, as long as it's sustainably managed, and ideally as species rich as possible, because the more species rich a grassland is shown the better carbon store it can be. And I was just finishing with that to say, well, yes, keep on eating meat, but make sure it's the best quality you can. Eat less of it and eat better, and enjoy your dinner. And don't buy meat from McDonald's. Are we there?
Thanks, Phil. That was good. It was good to get that last slide in, I think.
Yeah, I wasn't sure exactly where I'd stopped.
I think that was. I think you nailed it. Actually, I think that was pretty much where we lost you. So
okay,
that was good. And I think that last sort of statement, really, of having sustainably produced meat on species-rich grassland,
well, I think
seems to be the key way to go.
It all ties in with the principles of regenerative agriculture, I think, as well. So we're actually approaching a sort of a whole package that integrates biodiversity, carbon storage, and maintaining farming livelihoods, I think, at the same time.
And luckily, that seems to be something that we're increasingly hearing more about as well, which is a good thing, I think. Right, I've got a range of questions for all of you. Pen, I see you're on mute, but there's a couple of questions here. You had that picture of the cattle ravaging the trees. I know that I have been to sites with absolutely amazing, beautiful, ancient oak trees on their last legs because of overstocking and things. How do you kind of balance the damage done to trees with obviously the benefits that it gives to your livestock as well?
I think I'm off mute, aren't I? It depends very much on the site and what your site objectives are. You know, if you're wanting an open grassland, then you want your young trees and shrub nibbled back because you don't otherwise get your open grassland. If, on the other hand, you want to protect your trees, and then you should keep them away from your trees. So it's a balance. You know, when you've got younger hedgerows, when you've got old trees that need supporting, I'm always fencing stuff off. And people, because my sheep love their ash, they tend to demolish. But different trees have different palatabilities. And also at different times of year, so it's not that animals will destroy all trees. And I remember a story from someone who was talking about Kerry Hill sheep, and they had them on their land because they didn't think they attached the hedgerows and the sheep. And then one day, after a storm, an ash branch fell down. The sheep gobbled up the leaves, suddenly realised it was delicious, and after that, all the hedges had to be fenced off because suddenly the animals realised that this was a source of delicious food. So it depends on the animals that it's there, and it depends on what your aims are for the land, and you just have to work accordingly. If you want to protect your trees and you start seeing damage, then either you will remove the offenders before they can teach everyone else, or you remove the stock or fence off the areas that you want protected.
Okay, yeah, and I mean a lot of browse sort of forage is quite beneficial, I think, isn't it?
A lot of it's beneficial. You know, it has very high minerals. A lot of the tannins are good as anti-wormers, but too much of it. So often cattle will eat 12-15% of their diet can be browse, much more than they think. Goats obviously are even more. So it just depends. And again, as I say, people are always surprised at how much my Hebrideans eat compared to some other Hebrideans, but that's because that's what they're used to and what they've learned to eat as well. So you do get the variability between animals.
Yeah, I think that was something that came through in your talk and actually in Simon's as well, that kind of individuality of animals. Phil, there were quite a few questions around the carbon stats. Sam Kenyon wants to know what the unit used to measure the carbon stored in your tables. So what was it? He wondered if you might have missed it.
It is percentage of organic carbon.
Okay. And there was another one following on about data from improved grassland, which I did realise that you had actually added in there. And I wonder, I think you covered it actually. I wondered how the sort of more MG7s type grassland compared to your less improved sites.
Well, they are less good at storing carbon. It's as simple as that. They were included in the analyses, usually in relation to the kind of grassland that they should have been. So if they were in a sort of lowland meadow context, then they were included in the analyses as lowland meadow in poor condition.
Okay. So that's quite. I mean, I wonder, and I think there was a question that pretty much was saying, so a lot of this idea that you just said the idea that eating meat is bad, and the whole reports that have come out that suggest that. I mean, a lot of that is based on other countries, I believe, isn't it? So you feel that actually we look at sustainable grazing in a regenerative way, it's a completely different kind of system, isn't it, from American feedlots?
I think there is a massive difference between feedlot produced beef and grass-fed beef, and particularly species-rich grass-fed beef. And actually, I'd include in feedlot beef, I'd include British systems that rely on maize, because maize cultivation, I think, is it's another subject which we could probably go into for days, I should think. But I
Yes, we've all seen all the soil flooding out of maize fields, haven't we? Simon, we were quite interested in the lookers aspect. You're saying about you train people to be lookers, and I have heard about that for other sites as well. Is that something that is provided elsewhere, or do you do that? And what kind of checks do these volunteers actually do on the livestock?
Yes, I see somebody posted that there is other people that do train. Steve posted that they do training as well. I mean, it is a really nice job for volunteers if they're interested in livestock. But like everyone, they've got to know what they've got to look for. Some of the things that Pen was talking about. But a really enjoyable job, and often you can make the case where the farmer or landowner sees the site and the stock once a week, and for 3 or 4 days, a looker will look for them, and then you might have a couple of days when they go together, so that if there's any queries, they can ask the experienced hand, what to look for. But yeah, training is certainly available. We certainly run training courses, and a lot of other people would too.
Cool. Okay. Looking at that lovely big pile of seed that you harvested from that site, I think it was the one in Cornwall, wasn't it? Somebody, let's have a look, who was asking, Stephen Powell's asked why you clean the harvested seed, and is it absolutely necessary? Is that quite a laborious process, or?
Yeah, it is. We only do it to remove the chaff so we can spread it again. We don't separate the seed, but as everybody knows that tries to put seed through a spreader, if you've got too much chaff, you can't control the seed rate at all. So we put it through 3 different sizes of sieve, just so that what's left is mostly seed, and it spreads a lot better. Simple as that.
Okay, thank you. Nice and simple there. There's one here that's maybe a little bit longer for Pen. Desley White wants to ask you if you can say something about the animal welfare considerations of using the no-fence collars.
Okay, so I better explain about the no-fence collars to people who don't necessarily know what they are. So No-Fence is actually a company that are producing these collars. There are other companies available. I think I should do that disclaimer first of all. But No-Fence are a Norwegian company who have an office based in near Harper Adams near Telford. But what these are GPS tracked collars with solar panels on, and what they do is they basically set up a virtual fence. So instead of having that electric fence that you see everywhere or a physical boundary, what happens is you set up a sort of boundary using an app on your map, and then the GPS signal detects when the on the collar detects when it's approaching that boundary and gives the animal an audible signal. After, if it carries on, approaches and doesn't turn away from that signal, then it will get a small shock. It's thought, the companies claim that it's less than a shock that they would get from an electric fence, and so the animal turns back and is maintained. I should say that currently the Animal Welfare Committee has been asked by DEFRA and the devolved administrations to look at the animal welfare considerations of that, and we only started that review at the beginning of December, so whatever that is, 9 days ago, and we need to report by the end of March. So we're just starting to collect evidence for it. I have put out a number of emails on various forums, closed forums that are used by conservation graziers to ask what's happening. So I have some anecdotal data of what's happening. But as I say, we haven't determined all of it, because there is the question of whether that electric shock is being and they need to learn. So it's an aversive negative issue on that. But having said that, we've been talking, as I said, I was hearing people from the Gower Peninsula commons who have used the electric fencing to stop, or the virtual fencing to stop the animals going towards the road. And those 79 animals were all from animals which didn't have collars on, and the ones that were collared, and it's a relatively small sample, didn't go on the road and haven't been run over. So there's that sort of example. There are other examples of being able to hold them in fencing areas, and so you can maximize your grazing without having in an area and then move them on, so you can control what the level of grazing is. So the sort of things that Simon are talking about, and maybe Phil as well, in terms of maximizing the grazing, and then every time they graze down a bit, they can then go to fresh food. So they're, instead of having, say, a winter where you've always got a falling nutritional plane over time, they are getting a more steady or a staggered one, so their level of intake of nutrition isn't dropping over winter. There are other things like moving the animals by just opening up them and allowing them to move. It allows them to find their own way to their next site. So they're not necessarily being pushed to move to the next area. They're allowed to find it by changing the area of the size of their grazing area. There are things about keeping them away from public access, keeping them off trees. For those sort of things in a way. But again, we have to always settle about the case of is that just because it's helping our management, is it actually better for the animal? And the majority of people currently, anecdotally, that I've heard are saying yes. There are a few people who have great concerns about it. A lot comes down to how the animals are trained, and so that they really understand what this audible cue means. And some animals seem to get more shocks than others. But it's still early days for us to really be able to comment about it. Other countries have, like Norway itself, have accepted the welfare aspects, the benefits outweigh the risks. But we're still deciding that in the UK. Does that answer?
I think you've certainly addressed quite a few points there. So it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of this report is that you're involved
in. Next year, unless it extends, because they're realising how big a question it is actually, and how much interest there is in conservation graziers in using it. But we hope to be reporting in spring next year.
Cool. Now I'm realising we're at 9 o'clock, but there is one question that I'm quite keen to ask Simon, actually, because you looked at a lot of sites. We saw a lot of sites in your talk, and you're organic. Martin Steer wonders how you maintain organic status while grazing multiple sites, please.
Good question, Martin. The sites that I graze, I register. So I'm responsible for the grazing and the management of that during my grazing year. The sites, the smaller sites that I showed you on the slides, I would use as part of grazing links and find another grazier to graze those sites. So I don't graze any non-organic sites. All mine are registered. but a small site that's well fenced and watered is a really good introduction for somebody that's just starting livestock. And I'm finding more and more people that are trying to get their feet on the ground in agriculture and build up their livestock are very interested in learning about how to graze calm grassland. And obviously there's a good push towards the traditional breeds too. So a good pun for many people, you know, for the Rare Breed Survival Trust, and for people that are just doing conservation grazing through forage. So it's a good start for anybody that's trying to find acreage to graze.
Mm. And you mentioned you know, cattle obviously on your sites. Richard Crocker asked if putting pigs in culm is a good or bad idea.
I was wondering how to answer this one. Well, if it's under a scheme, obviously it's a bad idea because you can't turn the soil over. So a lot of the good quality calm grassland is under a countryside stewardship scheme. So no to that, Richard. But if you've got a poor quality rush pasture that has got no attachments, I can't see it doing any harm. But because turning the soil over with pigs might allow you to reintroduce some other species. But boy, they'll have plenty of mess. I know that.
I think there was a comment from Phil there that they will add a lot of dynamism
Yeah,
into it. They certainly do that, don't they? Yeah, thanks. I think there's just so many things to ask. Actually, I'm looking at some. There's a last question for Phil about. You talked about undermanaged sites. So just for people who perhaps are less familiar with that term, what do you sort of mean exactly by that?
There was a certain amount of subjectivity involved, at least in some of the surveys, but essentially the majority of those sites were ones that were totally unmanaged. So ones where there was no grazing and no cutting in recent years, and with, you know, obvious invasion by scrub or bracken or bramble, and quite often, you know, an accumulation of grass tussocks, Molinia litter, that sort of thing. In some sites were clearly managed to a certain extent, but obviously not enough to maintain them in good condition. So essentially not managed sufficiently to maintain favourable condition, but largely unmanaged completely. Okay,
just left sort of abandoned almost sometimes.
Yeah.
Rewilded, maybe not.
Well, the thing about rewilding is it actually needs inputs as well.
Those grazing animals, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're kind of run past 9 o'clock, so I think we've got a few more questions, but I think we will draw it to a close there. So I just would love to say thank you, a huge big thank you to you three speakers for agreeing to come on tonight, and also to everyone who's watching. It's been really, really interesting, and hopefully it's given some of our viewers some information and ideas and some inspiration as well to maybe try different things. I've put the link to the forum in the chat box, so do feel free to join up if you haven't already, and also do have a look at the More Meadows website. There's quite a lot of resources and things on there. So this is the last one for this year, last webinar. We've actually got a couple more, or a few more actually, planned for the new year, which you'll have to wait for the information for the dates and things for those. But we're going to be looking at having some speakers to talk about hedges, management, conservation, and all sorts of things around hedges and the wildlife that they support as well. Will be the first ones probably starting in February. So do check out the website, and the forum will be posting on there and through the usual channels. And a reminder that all of our previous webinars and talks are all available on the More Meadows YouTube channel. So just thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.